Welcome back for another daily devotion. Today we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And as Paul is writing to the Corinthians, he reminds them of the importance of love, and he reminds them that you need to love and build up your brother. And he gives a specific example saying you need to make sure that you love your brother and your sister and you build them up, and don't use your liberty in a way that would do harm to your brother or sister. We see that in chapter 8. And so we're just going to just brush through this quickly here. Paul, he reminds them that those that have knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And he wants to encourage them to grow in their love. He's not saying that knowledge is bad. We ought to have knowledge of the truth. We ought to grow in that. That was one of the things that Paul prayed for the Corinthians and for most of the churches that he ministered to, that they would grow in the knowledge of the truth. But Paul says, along with that knowledge, there needs to be love. And so make sure that your knowledge is working in accord and working out in a loving way. And he does this, and he gives the example by saying, be careful in the use of your Christian liberties. Don't do things that are right for you, and don't do them in a way that is going to harm other people. Now, he points out to food sacrificed to idols. And in order for us to really understand this, we need to understand the culture of the day. The Corinthians, they were a pagan culture. They worshiped idols, lots of false gods. The city was just rife with idolatry and wickedness of every kind. And these Corinthian believers were saved out of that. Now, some of these believers were mature in the Lord. Some of them had confessed Christ, and they ought to have been mature, but they were kind of infants in their faith, even though they should have been mature by now. And then you had others that were brand new believers. And so you had this mix of people that were just brand new in the Lord, and those that were immature, and those that were mature. And so Paul, he talks about don't harm your brother or sister by the use of your liberty, and he points to eating food that's sacrificed to idols. Now, he reminds them of the truth that idols are not real, that there is only one God, and that the gospel and salvation is in him, that God the Father and Christ Jesus, all things exist by him and through him. So Paul reminds them that idolatry is just a matter of people imagining that they're worshiping false gods. But these gods, they're not real at all. And he reminds them of this. But we get to verse 7. He says, however, not all men have this knowledge. Not all men are mature in their understanding that idols there's nothing to them and that they're not real. He says, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. And so Paul says that there are some people that if they eat meat that had been sacrificed to an idol, their conscience bothers them. They're convicted of that, and they feel like they're sinning. Now, some of the people that had just left idolatry, maybe eating meat sacrificed to an idol, maybe that would draw them back into idolatry. Maybe it was just something that bothered their conscience. Maybe some of these people were mature in the Lord, and in their zeal for following Christ, they said, I'm not going to have anything to do with idolatry. I'm not even going to eat meat that's offered to idols because I just don't want anything to do with idolatry. So there's kind of a spectrum of people of why they wouldn't eat this meat that was offered to idols. Paul's teaching is saying, hey, listen, is it wrong and is it sinful to eat meat sacrificed to idols? No. But if it's a stumbling block and if someone's conscience is sensitive to that, you need to be careful and you need to be sensitive to them. Don't make your liberty a stumbling block for your neighbor. That's what Paul is doing here. If we look down at verse 8, he reminds us, food will not commend us to God, that we are neither the worse off if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. So Paul says that the issue with food is not the issue. You could eat meat sacrificed to an idol, and it doesn't matter. Or you could forego the meat sacrificed to an idol. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make you righteous or unrighteous before God. Remember, Jesus declared all food clean. Now we get down to verse 9, and here's where Paul really gives the warning. He says, "But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." So the mature are able to say, hey, listen, idols are not real. This meat, I bought it in the marketplace. It was sacrificed to an idol. I could buy it. I could eat it. I don't worship idols. I worship the Lord. I know that he is the one who's provided this food, and so I'm going to eat it in gratitude and thanks. Well, some of the weak, they didn't have that knowledge, and so they would be convicted if they ate that food sacrificed to idols. Paul says, make sure that this liberty of yours does not become that stumbling block. And then Paul gives kind of an outrageous example. In verse 10, he says, if someone sees you who has knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat the things sacrificed to idols? So let's say there's a mature member of the church, and he says, hey, I'm going to go to an idol's temple. I'm going to have dinner. Now, is he allowed to do that? Yeah. Is that sin? No. Is he worshiping that idol? No, not at all. He could eat there. But Paul says, but what if someone sees you there and his conscience being weak, then he is motivated and he is kind of swayed. Okay, well, I could eat food that is sacrificed to idols. Well, if his conscience isn't there yet, then he's going to be convicted of that, and it's going to be a stumbling block. So Paul says, don't use your liberty in a way that is going to be harmful for your brother. In verse 11, he says, for through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, and the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Paul says this is serious. It's not sin for you to eat meat sacrificed to an idol. But if you do something that becomes a stumbling block for your brother, if you cause him to sin, you're sinning against him and you're sinning against Christ. That the law of love ought to be motivating you to say, hey, you know what? I don't want to do anything that's going to cause my brother to sin. And so I am going to restrain myself and I'm going to hold back from exercising my liberty because I want to love my brother. And so I want to build him up. And that's in this whole set of chapters we see in chapter 8, 9, 10, and going on, Paul is emphasizing love and building up the brother. So Paul says, hey, listen, don't go after your rights at the expense of the health of your brother. So you need to look out for him. He says, if you do that, you sin against the Lord. So in verse 13, he sums it up saying, therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. And so Paul, given this example, he says, hey, listen, if it's going to cause my brother to stumble, I'm not going to make use of that liberty. So Paul gives these examples. Eating meat sacrificed to idols is just one example. There's other ways that as Christians, we need to restrain our Christian liberties and our freedoms. You know, one way might be in the music that we listen to. One way might be in our conviction regarding raising our children. There's some families that are convinced and convicted that homeschool is the way to go. Others are saying, no, I want my kids in public school so they could have a ministry and they could do outreach. Well, that's a matter of conscience, but don't promote your rights and your liberties in a way that it's going to cause another person to stumble. So in this chapter, we see that Paul says, hey, prioritize love, right? In love, look out for the other brother. This is a key example and a key truth that we see all over the New Testament. So hope this is an encouragement to you. Let's make sure that we are loving one another as we ought to, serving the Lord. Look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.